Welcome, everyone. We're going to get started in just a minute or so, just to allow everybody to get in and get settled. Thank you for your patience. Okay, my clock says 32, so I think it's time that we get started. Welcome, everyone. My name's Steve Kenzie. I'm the Executive Director of the UN Global Compact Network UK. And today in this session, we're going to talk about the global goals and the just transition. And that transition that we're talking about, in case you were in any doubt, is to a net zero economy. Uh, this session is now the third in the Global Compact Network UK's Climate Forum, which is 2 days of climate action related programming that started this morning and will continue tomorrow. We're delighted to have you with us and hope that you'll also be able to join some of our sessions tomorrow. A bit of housekeeping. We have, you're going to be muted for the duration, but we have a Q&A box and a chat box. So please do your best to use both of those and put the chat in the chat. That's the best place for comments and any technical issues that you might have regarding sound or video. But if you have questions for our panelists, please do put them into the Q&A box, and that will help us to just keep things organized and flowing through. We're going to hear presentations from our panelists first, so do please type your questions in while they're speaking, and then we will have a Q&A session at the end where we will try to get to all of those. I think that's all I have for housekeeping. So next slide, please. Joining me today is Sue Ferns, Senior Deputy General Secretary from the Union Prospect, and also Rachel McEwan, Chief Sustainability Officer from SSE. So two experts on this subject, and both of their organizations have recently published very important guidance in this area. So we are really fortunate to be hearing from them. Next slide, please. Before we get started, though, we know with so many people participating that many of you may not yet be familiar with the UN Global Compact, and I'm duty bound to correct that situation. So as noted, we are the UN Global Compact Network UK, part of the world's largest responsible business initiative, the UN Global Compact. We connect companies and other organizations in a global movement dedicated to driving sustainable growth. The essence, the foundation, the heart of the UN Global Compact are 10 principles drawn from UN treaties in the areas of human rights, labor, environment, and anti-corruption. And those 10 principles underpin everything that we do. Local networks around the world, like ours, support the companies that have made this commitment by offering opportunities such as this to learn about the challenges to complying with these principles and to find ways forward. To join the Global Compact, and I hope you'll all give it some thought, requires a letter from your CEO to the UN Secretary General, and he or she needs to make 3 commitments. Firstly, to operationalize the 10 principles throughout your organization. Secondly, to be transparent and report annually on the progress you're making towards that goal. And thirdly, to support the wider UN development agenda, which at the moment is the Sustainable Development Goals. And that's what has brought us here today. And there they are. The focus today ostensibly is very much on Goal 13, but the key thing about Goal 13 is And that's, bottom left. Climate change impacts every one of these goals, and in many cases, those other goals impact climate change. If we create more sustainable cities, we can have make an important contribution to fighting climate change. If we fight climate change, we make an important contribution to reducing poverty and hunger and improving health and well-being around the world. And these interconnections are all over. Um, and so it's really important in our view that action on climate change respect and recognize how it fits into this wider holistic agenda. We can't focus exclusively on climate action without taking into account how those actions will impact, particularly on Goal 8 around decent work. There are a lot of people working in carbon intensive industries now, and we need to make sure that they're taken care of as we transition away from more carbon intensive ways of life. And of course, that's true across the piece. We really do need to make sure our climate action fits into that wider agenda. And so we're really fortunate today to have speakers that can illuminate that for us. And so next slide, please. I'm delighted to hand over to Sue, who's going to share with us her insights. Thank you, Sue.
Apologies, just needed to mute myself, which I hope I have done now. Steve, thank you very much for inviting me to speak this afternoon and for your introduction. As Steve says, I work for the trade union Prospect, which is a union of around 150,000 members, and we largely represent professionals and specialists across all sectors of the economy. So in this context, our significant membership in the energy sector and transport are obviously particularly relevant. But I'm also really proud to say that Prospect represents world-leading climate scientists, specialists on environmental management and conservation. So clearly we have a very deep interest in this issue and a lot of expertise amongst our membership. I also am pleased to chair the TUC's Advisory Committee on Sustainable Development. So I will reflect a bit as well on the wider TUC perspective on these issues. So I guess we're all here today because we're very well aware that the climate crisis is real, that it's happening now, and that we need to make major progress in the next decade. Start from a slightly downbeat perspective, we know in the trade union movement in the UK, however, that our history is one more of unjust transition than just transition. And if I think perhaps particularly of the decline in the coal mining industry in the UK, our former coalfields, still 25 years on, have lower employment levels and median earnings significantly below the national average. And those mining and manufacturing jobs that have been lost as a result of deindustrialization have often been replaced by low wage and insecure jobs, and communities left to deal with the consequences with little or no support or planning for change. So clearly what we need to do is to learn from that experience and look towards and work towards a better future where we do have just transition. And I'd like to reflect really that in thinking about that, it's important to have both an industrial or sectoral perspective and also a regional and global perspective. So from a sectoral point of view, I'm thinking in particular about our energy intensive industries, whether that's production, manufacturing, or energy generation, but also regions in the UK more broadly, where there's a lack of capacity to be able to adapt to a low carbon future, and those regions that are most dependent on natural resources. And of course, the international level, we know that the hardest hit will be the most vulnerable workers, especially women. But even in developed economies like ours, there's important issues around who pays for the transition. So if we could move to the next slide, please. I just want to say a little bit about why the climate crisis is very much an issue for us in the trade union movement. Of course, it's obvious that the greenhouse gas emissions that we need to tackle arise from how our economy and society are organised. And of course, work is an integral part of that and is core to our trade union mission. It's not to argue that we shouldn't take individual responsibility, because of course we should, but I think the scale of the challenge we face is such that we really need collective action across the trade union movement, and of course much more broadly than that. But we do believe that as worker representatives, we have a key role to play in that. Now, that could be because we have members at the front line of decarbonisation in those energy intensive sectors. But I'd like to think we also have a broader critical role in helping to speed and shape the policy environment so that we can achieve decarbonisation, as well as working more widely with employers as part of our workplace advocacy for adaptations in the workplace to ensure that climate change is taken seriously and that those policies and practices are brought forward to make a difference in every workplace. If we could move to the next slide, please. So what exactly do we mean? What do I mean by just transition? I think it's fair to say that just transition is well and long established as an international policy concept. But if I go out and talk to members of my union or other unions, I don't think it's a widely recognised and understood term. So for me particularly, just transition, it's not a complicated concept. It's about change, but it's about ensuring that that process of change is fair. And that must mean that workers and communities are not left behind, and that the costs and benefits of the change are distributed fairly. So from Prospect's perspective, and indeed from the TUC's perspective, key elements to this must mean a planned and funded route to net zero. This is not something that can be left entirely to market, and it's not a short-term political fix. What we need is a clear roadmap of how we're going to achieve net zero. We need commitment to that, and we need it to be underpinned by funding and policy certainty so that companies have confidence that they can invest in that future. Of course, I also want to see a green economy that is characterised by good jobs. What do I mean by that? I'm not simply talking about the pay associated with work. I'm talking about the intrinsic nature of that work, the ability for workers to use their skills effectively and productively, and also to be in jobs where they have opportunities for progression and growth. But we know that that process of change will probably, for many, require support for retraining or reskilling, and in some cases for relocation from where they live now to where the new green industries will be. So there must be support for impacted communities, but central to this is the voice of workers. They must have, with us as their trade union representatives, a key role in decision making, not after the event, but proactively. So if we could move on to the next slide, please. This illustrates one of three major areas for concern that I have at the moment. One is we need to think about both national and global responsibility. So if you look at the chart on this slide, you will see two lines, an orange one and a dark pink one, which start off almost mirroring each other, very close together, and that's for the period up until the mid-1980s, after which I think it's fair to say we saw a period of deindustrialization in the UK. And then after that period, those two lines diverging. Now, the bottom line is the UK's territorial emissions, and that's the line that governments like to talk about, because you can see it's on a bit of a downward track. But we can't just think about that, can we? We have to also think about the darker line, which is the UK emissions on a consumption basis. In other words, all the additional emissions that we're responsible for from the goods that we import and from offshoring our domestic emissions. And clearly, it's really important that we think about that. If I could move to the next slide, please. I also want to, perhaps not surprisingly, focus on the consequences for employment. Let me say very clearly, green has to be more than a label, and it has to be more than a lifestyle choice. It has to mean something to people in terms of their living standards and their employment prospects. Now, Prospect is a very strong supporter of growth in renewable generation. We advocate it, and we believe that renewables has a biggest role still to play in the UK's energy future. But what this slide shows is a series of bars. The one on the far left is 2014, and that goes through 2015, 2016, and 2017. And the various coloured portions in those bars show the share of different sources of renewable generation. So, for example, if you look at the yellow bars, you can see that there has been a contraction from 2014 to 2017, and that represents electricity generation from solar. And there's a clear reason for that, and that is a very distinct response to market signals, which have been short-term. These were market signals and subsidies introduced by government and withdrawn by government. And the market has responded in a perfectly logical way to that, but actually what we've seen as a result of that is a reduction in the jobs in that sector. If you look by contrast at the dark pink blocks, which represent offshore wind, that is actually the sector that has shown a net growth over this period, but you'll see not without some lumps and bumps along the way. And again, I think very clearly a response to market signals. So why is this? Other than a response to market signals, I think it's also very fair to say that these jobs do exist, but they don't exist for UK workers. There's been a large component of offshoring work in these new sectors. And I unashamedly say, as a representative of the UK trade union movement, we want to see a lot more focus on the development of UK supply chains and high quality UK jobs in support of renewable generation. Now, this chart goes up to 2017, and at that point, renewable jobs were down about 30% compared with 2014. It's fair to say that there has been a bit of a recovery since then, but at the moment, it's still a net decline over the years since 2014. So we are getting some good signals from government and some signals from employers that they want to deal with that, but that is really important to us. Green jobs must be good jobs, and they must be available to our workforce. And if we can move to the next slide, please. The next concern I want to raise, the final one really, is one around complacency. We have all seen during the coronavirus months significant reduction in economic activity, which has led to a reduction, not surprisingly, in greenhouse gas emissions. We must be clear that those are temporary reductions, and of course the cost of them have been very high in terms of the shrinking of the economy. And I'm pretty clear that that temporary adjustment is really going to have no significant effect on our journey towards net zero. We've already seen, for example, in China, which was one of the first countries affected by the virus, that emissions have rebounded. And in relation to our experience here in the UK, we've seen quite a decisive response to messages about using public transport, which has declined, very much offset by growth in road transport, second car ownership, and so on. And we really need to think about the medium and long-term consequences of that for our public infrastructure. So a number of notes of caution there. but I think perhaps also a few enduring lessons for the future. Undoubtedly, this has been a crisis like very few that we've experienced in recent memory. And I think it should give us all pause for thought about our resilience for crisis and how prepared are we for the next crisis that comes our way. And of course, from a trade union perspective, we've seen significant changes to the way that work is done in the economy, a huge growth in people working from home, which I think raises longer term and far-reaching questions about the shape of work in the future, about the balance between work life and home life, and how we ensure that those changes, to the extent that they've been positive, can be enduring, how fair they are to all workers, because let's be clear, not all workers have the facilities and amenities to be able to work from home effectively and undisturbed. So there's a lot of questions there, I think, to be dealt with in the period ahead. And of course, the final lesson that I'd like to highlight, which I think is really important, concerns the importance of public confidence and consensus in building support and real commitment to that period of change. We've seen very different experiences across the European continent about how governments have handled this and how our populations have responded. And I do think that has resonance for how we handle our adaptation to a net zero economy, which in turn has implications for who pays for those changes and who benefits from them. And we need to be very clear that we need to take people with us. This can't be seen as a punishment agenda. It has to be something that's fair and can command broad consensus. If I could move to the next slide, please. I did say that I would mention the TUC's work in this area. The TUC's published a couple of reports in the last 2 years. In 2019, it published the report on a just transition to a green and fairer economy, which set out the framework for putting just transition principles into practice. And the report below that, which is about voice and place, identifies industrial policy initiatives that will be required at national, regional and local level to bring about an economic recovery in a just way. And if I can move on to the next slide, just to say a little bit more about that TUC report. This is a report that was published this summer based on research and conversations with trade unionists in 4 English regions and in Wales. And what it does is it sets out the need for industrial policy initiatives at national, regional and local level. So at national level, the importance of an integrated policy framework and long-term planning with some support for specific industries. Because what is very evident is that there's not only differences between regions and nations, but also some significant differences within them. And the importance of an investment to support priorities and a clear focus on good jobs aligned with an integrated skills policy. At regional level, the report calls for stakeholders, combined authorities, councils, local enterprise partnerships and so on to be working with other local actors, community and workforce representatives to develop strong regional and local strategies. And of course, to do that on the basis of just transition. And that TUC report calls for a just transition commission along the lines of the one that already exists in Scotland. So if I move to my final slide, just please, just a word or two about what my own union is doing. We have published a Green Recovery Plan, and we've also published a discussion document about how we achieve just transition. And this is linking industrial strategy considerations with sectoral and regional dimensions, how these need to work together. And this is, again, motivated by our significant membership interest across the energy sector. So our Green Recovery Plan, it's a short document, it's a 10-point plan based on a need for a comprehensive net zero roadmap, which combines two complementary streams of investment. Firstly, in low carbon infrastructure, and secondly, in a net zero workforce plan. Now, we are waiting in the UK for the publication of the Energy White Paper, which I hope will set out the plan for low carbon infrastructure. The government recently announced its 10-point climate plan, which is fine. That sets a framework, it sets intent, but we actually need to see what that means in more detail and what it will mean in terms of implementation. And also, the government has set up a Green Jobs Task Force, which has been tasked to tackle the workforce and skills stream. So I hope we will move forward on both of those, because we in Prospect certainly see those as parallel lines of activity which need to progress in lockstep. And finally, in terms of our discussion document on how a just transition plan might work for the power sector, for me, a key message here is, from international policy concept to industrial implementation, this can be done. It requires will, it requires commitment, but it's not rocket science. We can have a net zero plan for the power sector. We are suggesting a just transition council for the sector, which would perhaps build on existing industrial councils and potentially report through to a regional or national just transition commission. We'd like to see a new employment and training portal to support this work, and that could link with some of our existing sector skills bodies. So I think we don't have to completely reinvent the wheel. We can use some of the infrastructure we've got, but reposition it to make clear our priority for just transition and net zero. We will need a training and relocation fund for workers. Some of that could be money that's repurposed, for example, from some of the apprenticeship program. And we do need a support fund for local communities. But again, that could be channeled very much to supporting net zero, for example, through energy efficiency retrofitting and through accelerating rollout of an electric vehicle infrastructure. And then finally, to move to my last slide, which is really to say, that's a very quick overview of what we'd like to see. This is an absolute priority for us. We asked our members through a survey at the start of this year, before the pandemic started, what were their priorities for union action. Number one was pay. You'd expect that in a trade union, but number two was climate, and that was both in terms of government policy direction, action in the workplace, and just transition. And those are our three pillars of work, and that's what we will be taking forward. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Sue. That was brilliant. I think it's really great news for all of us working in climate, to know that such an important ally is doing so much already in this space, and that you have such strong support from your membership as well. That's very encouraging. Could I ask just one point of clarification? Because I imagine others shared my surprise that overall jobs in renewables were going down. So this is UK jobs. So that's overall they're still going up as one would expect, but they're just not landing with UK workers. Is that the correct interpretation?
Yeah, that's true. I'm sure Rachel might have something to say about this as well. And to be fair, I think it's partly, well, a large part of this is that the market mechanism for awarding renewables contracts, which are very strongly focused on cost, and that's been successful. It's brought down the cost per megawatt hour, for example, of electricity generated from wind very significantly. But pressure to bring down the cost inevitably leads to decisions about where you source your requirements from. And I think, what we have seen is contracting and subcontracting of work to the Far East and across the world because it's cheaper to do that. So the work exists, but it hasn't fully, the full effect, the full benefit of it has not been felt in the UK. And that's important both for now, but it's also important in terms of our ability to build up supply chains and create those good jobs in the UK.
Yes. Okay. Thanks very much, Sue. Please, I invite everyone. Firstly, I wanted to say all of the publications that Sue referred to, we've provided links in the chat box so you can access them all there. If you are interested, please do type questions for Sue into the Q&A box, and we will come to your questions after we hear from Rachel, to whom I'm very happy to hand over now. Rachel.
Brilliant. Thank you very much, Steve, and thanks, Sue. That was a really good overview of the power sector and the things that needs to be done. In terms of the last point about jobs, I think this might be a good bit of discussion for us after I've done, I suppose, my wee spiel. Now, in terms of introduction, I'm obviously Chief Sustainability Officer for SSE Group, but I'm also a member on the Scottish Government's Just Transition Commission, and been working with trade union colleagues and a wide variety of people from industry on how we can create a framework for greater fairness, basically to make sure that the social consequences of net zero are predicted and preempted. So I suppose my job just now is really to give you a bit of a case study and to explain what a UK headquartered power company is doing and how we're thinking about our role in bringing about a just transition to net zero. And my plan is to give you an introduction to the strategy that we published last week, and I suppose how a company like SSE can be an agent of action and influence that supports a fair and just transition to net zero. But before I do that, and particularly because we're in this forum, a UN Global Compact forum, I did think there was just a little bit of company context that might be useful for you. And as you know, as many of you will be company employees, is that every company worth its salt will have a statement of intent and a set of purposes, a purpose that transcends the profit motive, and that this purpose is the way in which it meets its financial objectives. And in our company's case, the transition to a net zero energy system has been hardwired into our reason for being. And our strategy is to simultaneously create value for shareholders and society whilst doing so. And the framework that we use, of course we do, this is why we're here today, is that we use the UN SDGs as our framework for doing that. And we've identified the 4 most material SDGs, which for an energy company are reasonably obvious. But we also recognise that we impact further on another 4 goals. There's 3 environmental SDGs, number 12, 14 and 15, but we also have a role in reducing inequalities, and I'll come to that in a moment. Now, to embed those SDGs further, we have set 4 business goals aligned to SDGs 7, 8, 9 and 13, and performance against those goals is linked to executive remuneration. And you can see that our medium-term business ambitions are clearly linked to the UK and Ireland's journey to net zero. And I would describe us as being halfway through our transition to net zero, not necessarily in terms of the time taken, but certainly in terms of the reduction in our carbon emissions. 10 years ago, we were an electricity generator that was 1/3 coal, 1/3 gas and 1/3 renewables. Now we have no coal and we're reaching 50-50 gas and renewables. But we also have Paris-aligned interim science-based targets en route to zero. And I guess that's my point, is that as a company, but also as a society, we aren't starting with a blank sheet of paper. We are transitioning from one thing, a high carbon thing, into another, a low carbon one. And arguably, it is the next half of our journey that represents an even greater transformation. And Sue is dead right. The industrial transformations of the past are not covered in glory, and the decline of those former coal fields has had a lasting impact on people and their livelihoods. But if you also factor in the social consequences of not net zero on consumers and communities, you start to see the potential for significant social injustice, unless, as companies, governments, regulators and trade unions, we are super smart in predicting them and acting to preempt them. And while it is in all our interests that there is a fair and just transition, Just from a company perspective, the prize of a just transition is that the actions and investments required to decarbonise energy systems attract long-term public support and legitimacy. And that's why we published a Just Transition strategy last Wednesday. And at the core of this strategy are 20 principles to guide us in supporting a just transition. And we framed our thinking into two themes, kind of what I alluded to earlier, the notion that we're transitioning into something new and green at precisely the same time as exiting out of high carbon activity. Now, for the company, we've deliberately put the transitioning in first because we believe that's where SSE's most material impacts lie. We're investing £7.5 billion in 5 years into low carbon energy infrastructure in the UK and Ireland. And of course, that creates significant opportunity for economic prosperity. Right now, SSE is building more offshore wind capacity than any other developer in the world. But there has to be standards, safeguards, and principles that govern the nature of that new that is being created. And in terms of the jobs created, coming to Sue's point earlier, there are basic standards such as a real living wage, but also this idea that decent work means continued learning and the opportunity for progression. But there's also a nod in our strategy to the notion that what went before was not necessarily social utopia. This industry must become more diverse, both in gender terms and with more Black, Asian and ethnic minority participants. Now, our second pillar is about consumers. And sometimes when I think about the consumer, the multitude of opportunities that can arise for injustice can be overwhelming. But again, from a company perspective, our electricity networks can help make sure that difficult issues like how can there be universal access to smart electricity systems and some of the wonderful things that people will benefit from that, but also who pays for what and when. And those things need to be properly considered by regulators and government. Then we've got a third pillar, and this is the ability to share the economic value with local places. And this is a key element of a just transition. SSE's wind farm community benefit funds are now of highly significant scale. Probably around £250 million will be given to communities over the lifetime of our wind farms. But the most important area of all is the creation of an Indigenous manufacturing sector that can supply the components for offshore wind farms. And we say quite a bit about this in our strategy because it has not been plain sailing. And then there's the second theme, which is where as a company we are transitioning out of high carbon activity. And our first principle is to deliberately design to say that while high carbon assets do not have a long-term future, we are seeking to repurpose those assets for the net zero world. Gas plants located in places of strategic importance to the electricity system are valuable to society, and they're valuable to our shareholders too, as are the skills and knowledge of our workforce. But where there is no option in the longer term, we make commitments to our workforce to give notice, to work with trade union representatives, and to always prioritise redeployment and training first. And then our last pillar is to respect the role of communities. And we've learnt from our experience in coal that when a coal power station comes to the end of its life, it is very apparent that there is a pride for the social and industrial heritage of these sites. They provided livelihoods for 50 years or more and dominate local landscape. We must respect that legacy and consider those communities as a primary stakeholder in our plans. There's one last point I want to make. This strategy is simply a set of considered principles to guide us, but that's not the same as an action plan. We already know our immediate priorities, which is to help build the supply chain, but also to consider the distributional aspects of smart electricity systems. And we've committed to report against those, but also the next emerging priorities, and we'll report against those as we normally do in our sustainability report. And that's it. Thanks for listening. I'm looking forward to the next bit of discussion.
Thank you very much, Rachel. Now, I think, yeah, there we go. Thank you, Jess. So please, we've got a few questions, which is great, but do please keep them coming. Most of them so far are aimed at Sue, so we'll start there while Rachel's interrogators warm up their fingers. So I think that the very first one that came in, I thought struck me as being quite interesting. So, um, Sue, is it possible for different trade unions to act on a collective basis, considering that certain sectors and union members will bear the greatest impacts? I'm thinking specifically about the need to transition away from gas boilers to heat our homes. So clearly, just as there are winners and losers, um, presumably amongst organized labor, there will be uh, some sectors that are benefiting from all of this and may create some tensions. Are you finding that?
So there are undoubtedly different union perspectives on this, but actually I think a strong basis of agreement as well. So if we look, for example, at heating, which the question refers to specifically, this is probably one of the greatest challenges in terms of decarbonisation. And it will require a whole range of different types of skills and inputs in order to achieve that across a wide variety of sectors in the industry. As a group of energy unions, we work very closely together on this, and we work in a coordinated way when we talk to our energy regulator and also to government about it. So clearly, there's very strong links and common purpose there. I suppose the other dimension to this question is, well, what about the workers and the unions that don't have that same kind of direct interest? Look, we have within my union, as I think all unions do, a variety of members, those whose work is directly impacted, but much bigger number of members who are concerned citizens and want to make a difference as concerned citizens. What we are attempting to do, both within Prospect and the TUC, is to work those interests together, because actually we have the same goal, the same prize in mind. It's just that we have perhaps different priorities or different perspectives to bring to bear on it. And it is about being able to articulate that very clearly to everybody. And if we achieve a just transition for workers and communities, which we're all agreed on the need for, that I think is the key driver of how we bring about that.
Perfect. Thanks, Sue.
Well, Steve, you've managed to pop yourself on mute there.
I beg your pardon. One for Rachel. In terms of supply chain issues and wider transition challenges, how have you faced those alone? Do you think you even have? To what extent have you collaborated with others, be it unions, government, trade associations, competitors, and so on?
Okay, really good question. And I'm not sure I've got a clear answer, but the first thing to say is that we can't possibly bring about a thriving supply chain in the UK without others. We can't do it ourselves because we aren't a supply chain, if you know what I mean. We're a different type of company. So the only way that you can achieve that is by working with, cajoling, persuading, sometimes putting some money to it. That's the way in which you do it. So you have to do it collaboratively. And we are working very closely behind the scenes with particular supply chain partners, plus the government, in order to try and stimulate some particular investments in the short term that will bring about at least a little bit more manufactured content in the UK. In terms of the trade unions, so there's two levels to this. We have, I would say, describe our trade union relationships within the company as being very mature, as you would expect for a company like us. But also at the national level, we are, discussing regularly with national trade union representatives the actions that we can take as a company to bring about more manufactured content. One of the things I would like to just pick up on in terms of those job numbers. So one of the reasons why there is been a sort of almost like a boom at certain times in the renewable sector is because building the wind farms or the installations takes up an awful lot of labour. So you can see what happened with solar is that almost all jobs in the UK associated with solar were in solar installation, because we have hardly any solar manufacturing in the UK. Likewise, when you have a boom in onshore renewables, there are a lot of people employed for a reasonably short period of time to build them. So that's why you get those ebbs and flows, I suppose. What we're going into now is a period of significant construction offshore. So Sue's right about the fact that that's going to pick up again.
Thanks very much, Rachel. Bit of housekeeping. Please put your questions in the Q&A box. No need to put them in the chat box either. Getting a little overwhelmed with all of the text and keeping it all straight. A quick question I think we can dispense with fairly quickly, but Rachel, Sue, do correct me if I'm wrong, but it was just a more international question about UK companies with offices in Africa or internationally. And I'm not really feeling that's within our scope so much today, but do correct me if I'm wrong. However, the Institute for Human Rights and Business, a fantastic organization that's based here in the UK, but more global in their orientation, have a fantastic session coming up on just transition next month. And that will undoubtedly take a more global view of the question, whereas our focus is a little more on the UK. So I'm going to direct anonymous attendee to do that, or maybe Jess, you could find a link to that. We could put it in the chat. But I'm happy, Rachel, Sue, if you wanted to comment on the global, most welcome. I'm giving you an out though if you don't want to. Okay.
I wondered,
yeah, go ahead, Sue.
if I could comment on a couple of the other questions. So there were an anonymous question: can we provide an example of relocating jobs which actually implemented and worked? And I think we do have some examples in the UK. And I'm thinking of the energy sector, companies like SSE, but other companies as well, that have changed their energy portfolios, and in particular closed down coal-fired generation. And they have worked quite well with us as unions to, in an internal market, if you like, to relocate people from one part of the company to another and provide training and support for people to do that. So it is happening. I think the challenge as we move to net zero is that it's not always going to be possible to do that, and people will need to move out of companies into new organisations and potentially for further distances across the UK. So we know it can work, but we haven't yet seen it working at scale, although I still maintain we can make it work at scale by working together. And there's also a question there from Deba about lack of opportunities for BAME workers and professionals. And Rachel mentioned the need to improve diversity in the sector, which I absolutely agree with. And I think what I would say in response to that question is there is no lack of opportunities. There's a very good report from National Grid about the net zero workforce, which very clearly demonstrates a huge level of job opportunities there will be in the future, moving into the hundreds of thousands as the industry adapts to meet this challenge. And also the fact that it will need new skills, more data and digital skills, for example. So there are huge opportunities. The issue is about how more diverse workforces are attracted into the companies, and that's part of the issue. But it's also, I think, about getting people in, making sure that there's the right support and the right cultures to keep people once they're in the industry. And that point I made earlier about good jobs, about providing progression opportunities for people as well. And I know that Rachel agrees with this because that's in the SSE document that was published last week. I think the challenge there is everybody knows it needs to be done. Everybody has good intention, but it's not happening fast enough, anywhere near fast enough, or at the scale that's required. And again, I do think this is something where we need to work together, companies, unions and government. We need to think about support through the skills system, but we also need to think about working life and the working environment once people do come into these sectors. So I think it's a huge job for all of us, but unless we crack it, this industry is not going to have the workforce it needs for the future.
Thanks, Sue. Let me just plug some work that we just finished. We had a 6-part Black Lives Matter and business webinar series that just ended yesterday. And we had sessions on recruitment, advancement, retention, very practically oriented guidance to help companies that want to improve the representation of Black and ethnic minority workers. So recordings of that are available via our website that everybody's most welcome to grab. Rachel, did you see any questions there that caught your fancy that you would like to take on, or shall I? I'm very happy for you to choose.
I have to say I'm struggling to follow where we're at. There seems to be a lot of questions, but there was one that I saw, I think it was Gurjit, that had asked about the supply chain. And I suppose there's a link here to, in Sue's slides, that graph that showed territorial emissions versus offshore emissions. And that's true from a UK perspective. So the UK's net zero law is for net zero at a territorial basis. But for companies that have got science-based targets, we're one of them, then it's not just a territorial basis. So scope 3 emissions are basically those offshore emissions. So companies that are serious about being on their own trajectory to 1.5 are thinking very carefully about their scope 3 emissions. And of course, that links to Gurjit's question, which is about, basically how do you go about implementing sustainability in your supply chain? And there's no doubt that this is the hardest thing. If you're a sustainability professional, this is the most tricky thing to do. But if I was to describe the only way to achieve it is basically that you have to do due diligence on your suppliers. You need to make sure that the requirements for them even to be looked at are strict and tough. The second thing is that you have contractual obligations, particularly around modern slavery. But actually, we learned a lot 7 years ago when we implemented the real living wage, because at the time the real living wage wasn't as big as it is now, and at the time we were the first big company with a complex supply chain to implement the real living wage standard through our supply chain, because in all honesty it didn't have a massive impact on our employees. As you would expect, a company in our sector, the wages are above the real living wage, but it does have an impact in certain parts of our service and works contracts. So what we did was, we weren't in the business of looking for suppliers not to work with. We were in the business of making sure our suppliers paid the real living wage. That was the whole point, is to get people's wages up. And we learned a lot from how you implement that through your contracts. And to be honest, when it comes to carbon or human rights standards or biodiversity or ecosystem requirements that we're now placing on our supply chain, then increasingly we need to do that through contractual standards. And then the last point in terms of how you do it in the supply chain is that you have to do spot checks. So the only way to be really sure, particularly with difficult issues around modern slavery, is that you have to be able to have the right to turn up unannounced and check that things have been implemented. I don't know if that helps, Gurjit.
Thanks, Rachel. Now, I'd like to turn to a very topical question regarding the government's recently released 10-point action plan for the Green Industrial Revolution. Maybe I put quotes around that. Still a lot of mystery embedded in the 10-point plan, and I'm not sure if you've had the chance to get fully up to speed on that, but it would be great to hear your views. And do you think there's enough in there around this particular issue around a just transition? Because I think clearly the government has a huge role to play in making sure that things go this way.
Do you want me to go first?
Sure, you start if you'd like, Rachel. Yeah, thanks.
Oh, okay. I'm sure Sue will actually have actually more richer contributions on this for the whole system. But I mean, as generally speaking, as a company, we welcome every bit of progress. So any progress is a good thing. In terms of the things that we are hoping for, so in that the 10-point plan, there is, you know, the confirmation of the ambition to have 40 gigawatts of offshore wind in the UK by 2030. That is fantastic and that is great. However, we've got 10 gigawatts so far. It's taken a lot of blood, sweat and tears to get to a point where you've got 10 gigawatts in the waters. And to get another 30 gigawatts delivered between now and 2030 is going to be pretty heroic. And in other words, if we do things exactly the way we have been, we won't reach that target. And the reason why offshore wind is so important is because it's effectively got to cost parity. So, you know, 10 years ago, it cost more to build renewable energy than it would have been for you know, for the equivalent gas plant, but now it's not. That actually the cheapest way to generate electricity is from offshore wind. So, and of course it is like the gateway into decarbonising electricity and heat as well. So it's hugely important for our net zero ambitions. But of course, we need to do more with it too. We need to get that key thing around manufactured content. And that means we need to have reform to the CFD as well, because we need to create a level playing field that will make it possible for companies like us to be able to you know, direct our investment more specifically into domestic, you know, indigenous supply chain. But the country is also going to need to do two more things. They need to invest in ports and harbours. Most of our ports and harbours are not offshore wind ready. And we also probably need to be doing, as Sue would talk about, a proper regional and national industrial strategy that invests in some of the factories and the yards that will produce this. Does that help?
That's great. Sue, would you like to add anything? We're heading towards last words, so it'd be great to hear from you on this.
Yeah, last words. So I think the fact that the 10-point plan has been published is a positive. There's not very little in terms of its aspirations that I would quarrel with. I would have liked to see it more presented as a whole system approach rather than separate pots for different energy sources. But the key test really is how you turn those aspirations into implementation. And what I would say is there's a real sense of urgency around this. We've been waiting in the UK an awful long time for an energy white paper, where I think we're all hoping we will see that detail or see sufficient detail. But we also need urgency. I started off by saying, you know, we've really got to make a difference over the next decade. And that means we need to be taking decisions now. So my criticism would be that the decisions that to bring into being the aspirations are not yet clear, but we want to see them and we want to see them now. And in terms of just transition, well, there isn't anything really in the 10-point plan about just transition. Certainly nothing that would resemble the ILO's just transition principles. But because I believe that we do need to build this consensus and we do need to build this process of fair change, I would like the government, every time it talks about climate and net zero, to be talking about just transition, to make absolutely clear that this is not another process of change that is going to have costs that are more severely felt by some communities, by some people, by some income groups than others. The two need to go hand in hand. We haven't seen that yet.
Thanks very much. I think that's a really important message to close on, that really any conversation about the transition needs to be talking about a just transition, and that's got to be front and central. Rachel, Sue, it's been an absolute pleasure chatting with you today. I wish we had more time, but we've now crossed over to 4:30, and I still have one more slide that I was very keen to share with you, just to finally just give you a little bit more about our climate forum. We have 3 more fantastic events coming tomorrow. One of the biggest challenges for companies setting a net zero target or a science-based target is how do they deal with their scope 3 emissions. We have a session looking at precisely that, and more specifically even how to reduce your emissions from the use of sold products, a very difficult and challenging area. I hope you'll be able to join us. We also have a session with Richard Curtis, the filmmaker, and Tony Burden, the CEO of Make My Money Matter, along with Emma Douglas from Legal in General, talking about sustainable pensions and how we can all contribute to sustainable finance through our pension savings and how important it is that we do so. And then finally, one of the biggest, I think one of the most controversial aspects of net zero targets is around the role of carbon offsetting. And we're going to have a formal debate. We've got 2 teams lined up to duke it out over the question of yay or nay on carbon offsets. It's going to be fun and really, really informative. For anyone thinking about how they're going to reach net zero, you probably also should be thinking about what role carbon offsets are going to play in you achieving that. So I think that one's going to be unmissable. Thanks so much for your all your questions. Really sorry that we couldn't get to them all. It was just obviously too much for the time we had. I hope we'll see you all again tomorrow. Again, Rachel, Sue, thank you very, very much. Thank you, Claire and Jess behind the scenes. I hope you all have a lovely evening, and I look forward to seeing you again.
Thank you.